We cancelled your RSVP, Dad. And just to be clear, no, you are not walking me down the aisle. You wouldn't fit in. The voice, belonging to my daughter, Olivia, was sharp and devoid of inflection, like a blade perfectly honed. It wasn't the rejection that shattered me. I had long known where I stood in her meticulously curated world. It was the quiet confidence in her delivery. She truly believed that Arthur Vance, the architect of everything she had, was nothing more than an inconvenient shadow. I lowered the phone slowly onto the mahogany desk, the sound barely audible in the vast silence of my study in Greenwich, Connecticut. 4 decades. 4 decades of breathing life into Vance Global Logistics, expanding it from a single rusty truck financed by a debt I thought would kill me, into an international artery of commerce. I missed birthdays, I missed anniversaries, I traded sleep for spreadsheets, all so my children, so Olivia, would never have to know the gnawing fear of the rent man coming. My hands, though aged and slightly stiff from old factory work injuries, still held the power to sign checks that moved economies. Yet to Olivia, I was just the man who insisted on wearing the same worn-out leather jacket and drove a 7-year-old Ford pickup, refusing to parade the wealth I had accumulated. I did it partly out of habit, but mostly out of a deep-seated desire to test the waters, to see if the character I thought I had instilled in them could survive the comfort I had provided. It failed spectacularly. Over the last 10 years, my life had become a stage for their grand performance of entitlement. My late wife, before she passed, set the precedent, viewing my accounts as an endless, silent river of gold for her endless shopping expeditions and poorly advised investments. After her death, the children, particularly Olivia, picked up the mantle. They didn't ask, they demanded, they didn't appreciate, they expected. They were merely waiting for the day I finally retired, or better yet died, so they could sell the assets and finally live the glamorous life they felt I was too stubborn and too unfashionable to provide them. I had listened to the whispers. At a family gathering last Thanksgiving, Olivia, believing I was in the garden, had told her fiancé, Caleb, that the old man is finally showing signs of decline. We just need to manage his estate, planning until the wedding is over, then we can push for the final transfer. That conversation, overheard through a slightly ajar door, didn't trigger an emotional outburst. It triggered a corporate restructure. The patriarch may have looked simple, but the CEO was ruthless. The day after Olivia's call, the call where she deemed me too poor to attend her extravagant nuptials at the Biltmore, I made 2 calls. The first was to my most trusted legal counsel, Mr. Stern. The second was to the surveillance firm that handled high-level corporate espionage. I gave them one instruction regarding Caleb: find the absolute truth, then find the leverage. The investigation was beautiful in its efficiency. Caleb Davies, the charming, impeccably tailored finance broker, wasn't just broke. He was catastrophically leveraged. He had debts tied up with several unsavory figures in Miami, and his successful portfolio was a carefully constructed house of cards. He was marrying Olivia not for love, that was obvious, but to gain immediate access to the trust fund that would activate upon the marriage certificate being signed, a fund I had set up years ago, foolishly believing it would secure her future. The real discovery, however, was the side piece, a waitress from Phoenix who had Caleb's heart, or at least had his full attention, and a key to his second, secret apartment. My investigators provided photographs, phone, transcripts, and even a legally binding affidavit detailing Caleb's plan to siphon the trust money, to settle his personal debts, and then disappear, leaving Olivia to manage the fallout. I didn't confront Olivia. Confrontation was messy. It gave the target time to react. I chose precision. The wedding day arrived sunny and opulent, exactly the spectacle Olivia demanded. I stayed in my study, the old leather jacket draped over the chair. I watched the live stream feed, procured by Stern's team through a cleverly placed bug in the catering tent, feeling nothing but a profound, cold sense of closure. My gift, I had decided, would be delivered 30 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to start. I had Mr. Stern personally hand-deliver a thick, heavy envelope to the best man, with instructions that it was a final offering from Arthur Vance to be given to the groom immediately. Inside the envelope wasn't a check or a piece of jewelry. It was a single legally notarized document, a non-disclosure and settlement agreement. Attached were high-resolution photographs of Caleb and the woman in Phoenix, and a summary of his $800,000 debt portfolio. The document stipulated that if Caleb signed the NDA, he would receive $100,000 in untraceable crypto, enough to clear his most urgent debts and disappear quietly, immediately, with the promise that the full dossier on his financial crimes would never see the light of day. If he refused, the entire package, including the evidence of his affair and his illegal financial maneuvers, would be immediately emailed to the SEC, the wedding planner, and most importantly, the entire guest list, who were all high-powered clients of Vance Global. Caleb saw the leverage immediately. He could have the money and salvage his skin, or he could ruin himself and Olivia publicly. The video feed showed the subsequent chaos. Caleb, sweating profusely in his tuxedo, gripping the envelope, arguing frantically with the best man, completely ignoring the frantic calls of the wedding coordinator. He looked terrified. He looked cornered. 30 minutes later, the venue doors remained closed. The orchestra stopped playing. A frantic voice, identified later as the wedding planner, grabbed the microphone and announced, clearly bewildered, "There has been an unforeseen family emergency. The ceremony has been cancelled. We apologize deeply for the inconvenience." I leaned back in my chair, the sunlight catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Olivia's ambition, her cruel dismissal, had just been vaporized by a single act of cold, silent administration. I hadn't destroyed her life. I had merely shown her the truth about the man she was marrying, using the language she understood best: financial coercion and total control. The phone rang. It was Mr. Stern. "It's done, Arthur." Caleb signed. "He's on a private flight out of state already. He left the wedding ring on the table." I simply nodded, though he couldn't see me. "And Olivia?" "She's hysterical, blaming the world. She still doesn't know the full extent of what happened. She just thinks Caleb panicked." "Let her believe that," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I sent her a gift, Mr. Stern, a true gift, the gift of not being ruined by a snake. Whether she appreciates it or not is irrelevant." I hung up, finally allowing myself a slow, deep breath. The house was quiet, the empire secure, and the ingrates for the first time in their lives were facing the consequences of treating their foundation like dirt. I was alone, yes, but the weight of 4 decades of obligation had finally lifted. I picked up the old leather jacket, ready to drive my modest pickup. The next chapter, I knew, would be just for me. The engine hummed low, a gentle rumble that was a stark contrast to the roar of the custom sports cars parked in the driveway I was leaving behind in Greenwich. They always laughed at this truck, calling it Dad's Antique, a relic from the time before the millions. They mistook humility for idiocy, assuming the man who built the empire was somehow separate from the man who still drove a modest Ford F-150. That was the core of their blindness. They saw the wealth, but they never truly saw the structure, the strategy, or the sheer, brutal determination that sustained it. For years I had been the silent, reliable force, the foundation they walked on without glancing down. My wife, Eleanor, had perfected the art of the expensive sigh, a subtle indication that my presence was generally necessary only when a new wing was needed on the summer house in Nantucket, or when the quarterly trust disbursement was delayed by a single afternoon. My 2 children, Robert and Jessica, treated the balance sheet of my company, Drake Logistics, not as an achievement I had sweated 4 decades for, but as a guaranteed inheritance, a future ATM that required 0 effort from them. The final straw wasn't the cost. I could afford their extravagance. It was the profound, casual disrespect. It reached a crescendo last Thanksgiving, when I overheard Robert standing near the antique liquor cabinet, assuring his golf buddies that the old man is winding down, just waiting for the inevitable. He chuckled. "We're setting up the foundation now, making sure the estate taxes don't eat into the fun." That conversation, more than any stolen kiss or secret bank account, was the moment I stopped being their father and started being their opponent. My world was built on logistics and security. I specialized in moving high-value assets securely across 3 continents. To them, I was just a businessman. To the intelligence community, I was a quiet master of infiltration and data retrieval. They thought the old man was slowing down, perhaps forgetting things. They had no idea that I was simply redirecting my resources. The transition from concerned husband and father to silent investigator was clinical. It began not with a fight, but with an upgrade to the household security system. A proprietary system I designed myself back in the late 90s, the one they never bothered to learn how to operate properly. I installed high-definition cameras disguised as thermostat sensors and motion detectors in key areas: the home office, the garage, and the entryway where Eleanor often held her clandestine meetings with her yoga instructor, a man 20 years her junior, who smelled suspiciously of cheap cologne and desperation. The audio feeds were illuminating. They weren't just plotting my death, they were actively draining the liquidity, convinced I was too senile to notice the subtle shifts in the offshore accounts I had established, precisely for their protection. They had begun liquidating assets from the non-voting shares of Drake Logistics, assuming the documentation was too convoluted for me to track immediately. I didn't confront them. Confrontation is noise. I needed silence. My first call was not to a divorce lawyer, but to Daniel Shaw, the best forensic accountant in Manhattan, a man who once spent 6 months tracking $20 million through a web of shell companies hidden in the Caymans. I gave him 6 weeks and one command: untangle every thread of unauthorized spending, every secret account, every gift, and document the intent to defraud. Shaw worked like a surgeon, confirming the betrayal with cold, mathematical precision. Jessica had indeed funneled nearly $1 million into a defunct crypto scheme, and Robert was using the company's real estate arm to secure personal loans he had no intention of repaying. Next came the legal architecture. I flew to Miami, meeting with Mr. Sterling, the only trusts and estates lawyer I trusted, the kind who works in whispers and doesn't leave paper trails. We established the Phoenix Trust. This was a structure so complex, so layered with contingency clauses and jurisdictional barriers, that it would make the IRS weep. The core of the strategy was simple. They believed the bulk of the estate was controlled by the Revocable Living Trust, which would distribute upon my death. What they failed to notice, because they never read the fine print I drafted in 2018, was the existence of the Declaration of Definitive Incapacity, a document granting the executor, me in this specific scenario, the power to immediately transfer all major assets into the irrevocable Phoenix Trust upon confirmation of willful malfeasance by the primary beneficiaries. The evidence Shaw compiled was the confirmation. The willful malfeasance was irrefutable. For 3 months, I lived a dual life. By day, I was the slightly frail, slightly deaf patriarch, nodding along to Eleanor's complaints about the gardener. By night, I was signing, notarizing, and executing the paperwork that would dismantle their carefully constructed future. Every piece of evidence, every transfer, every sealed document was meticulously logged and stored in 3 separate locations: a vault in Zurich, a digital archive protected by military-grade encryption, and a safe deposit box in a small, obscure bank in Charleston, South Carolina, a place they would never think to look. The genius of the plan was its invisibility. They continued their spending spree, unaware that the money flowing from the trust accounts was now strictly monitored, and every dollar they took was meticulously catalogued as a debt against an estate they would never inherit. I was allowing them to dig their own financial graves, using my money for the shovel. I hadn't just secured my assets. I had legally insulated the company and its honest employees from their incompetence. Drake Logistics would survive. Their luxury lifestyle wouldn't. Now, hours after the final documents were filed, sitting in the cab of my old truck, I felt the satisfying finality of a lock clicking shut. I was driving toward Asheville, North Carolina, a place far from the gossip of Connecticut society, a place where a quiet man could buy a small plot of land, and maybe, finally, build something just for himself. I had done my duty to my legacy. The paperwork was set to execute the final transfer at midnight. When the sun rose tomorrow, the lawyers would arrive at the Greenwich estate, bearing stacks of paper, not accusations. The house would still be there, the cars too, but the funds that fueled the life inside would have evaporated, legally and irrevocably redirected. They wouldn't understand how it happened. They would look for a bomb, but I had used a scalpel. They expected a confrontation. They got silence, and silence, when backed by the full force of the law and 4 decades of corporate power, is absolutely deafening. I checked the GPS on my phone. The mountains were calling. I pressed the accelerator, leaving the phantom weight of betrayal behind me, finally free to breathe the air I earned. The phantom weight lifted, but the memory of the sheer, staggering arrogance they displayed remained, sharp and toxic. They didn't just betray me. They fundamentally misunderstood the man who built the foundation they stood upon. For the last 18 months, Sarah and Michael had viewed me as a pleasant inconvenience, a checkbook with a weak pulse, scheduled for expiration. They stopped whispering, replacing their coded glances with open, condescending exchanges at the dinner table. They spoke about future liquidity and estate planning, as if I were a particularly slow-moving tropical storm whose passing was inevitable and beneficial to the local economy. That was the heart of my advantage, their certainty. They confused my deliberate silence with senility, my measured patience with resignation. Sarah, my wife of 35 years, had perfected the role of the dutiful, long-suffering spouse, while simultaneously diverting millions into offshore accounts she believed were undetectable. Michael, my only son, had been busy padding supply contracts through shell companies that, ironically, I had taught him how to set up 20 years ago. The architecture of their betrayal was shoddy. They relied on my assumed incompetence to conceal their amateur maneuvers. They believed the old lion had lost his teeth. But the lion hadn't lost his teeth. He had simply traded them for a highly specialized, custom-built surgical steel scalpel. I had spent 4 decades building sterling holdings from a single warehouse in Connecticut into a multi-state behemoth. That required more than just business acumen. It required the ability to predict human behavior, especially greed. When Sarah started taking unexplained trips to Miami and Michael began aggressively pushing for a new CFO, a man he played golf with every Tuesday, I didn't hire a divorce lawyer. I hired Frank. Frank wasn't a man who tracked cheap adultery. He was a corporate ghost, a forensic intelligence operative who specialized in untangling complex webs of financial misconduct. He looked less like a private investigator and more like an unassuming middle management accountant, which made him invisible. His initial findings were devastatingly simple. They weren't being clever. They were being careless, convinced they were dealing with a predictable victim. The physical investigation was the easy part. Tiny, high-definition pinhole cameras were installed in the antique clock in my study and behind the leather-bound copy of Moby Dick on the library shelf. The microphones were sensitive enough to catch Sarah detailing her plans to liquidate certain assets immediately following my next scheduled heart examination. Hearing her cold, calculating voice detailing the timeline of my expected death as if she were scheduling a dental appointment was the moment the residual pain turned into absolute clinical clarity. There was no rage left, only the chilling imperative of justice. The real work was the legal construction. We created the Irrevocable Trust of 2024. It was a masterpiece of legal engineering, crafted in utter secrecy by a law firm in Delaware that specialized in wealth protection for high-risk individuals, meaning people who had family members plotting their demise. Frank and his team secured proof of the infidelity, the embezzlement, and the specific conversations confirming their intent to commit corporate fraud. We didn't need this evidence for court. We needed it for leverage and, more importantly, for the psychological impact of the reveal. The trust was designed to be ironclad, legally impervious to challenge. It stated explicitly that any beneficiary found to have engaged in fiduciary misconduct, fraud, or intentional harm against the grantor, me, would be instantly and permanently disinherited, their share reverting to a carefully selected list of educational charities and, crucially, to a new holding entity, controlled exclusively by me. The beauty of the trap was its subtlety. I didn't need to file for divorce first. I didn't need to yell or accuse. I simply had to sign the paper that restructured the entire financial universe they thought they owned. For months, I continued playing the role of the ailing patriarch. I'd cough dramatically during meetings, nod vaguely at Michael's questionable proposals, and even cancelled a few important trips, citing fatigue. Sarah would bring me herbal tea and discuss the latest remodel plans for the villa in Nantucket, a property that, unbeknownst to her, had already been quietly moved into the new trust's protected portfolio. They ate up the performance. Their condescension grew exponentially. Just last week, Michael had called me the old man to his golf buddies, loud enough for me to hear from the kitchen. Sarah, meanwhile, had begun referring to the current year as the final year of the waiting period. I remembered sitting in my office in downtown Boston, watching the digital countdown Frank had installed on my secure laptop. It wasn't counting down to my death. It was counting down to the activation of the trust. The legal paperwork had been filed, sealed, and set for automated electronic activation precisely at 9 a.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, the exact moment Sarah was scheduled to meet with the bank manager to discuss the pre-liquidation strategy of my primary investment, accounts. I had left Boston late last night after reviewing the final details with Frank. He didn't wish me luck, he simply nodded and said, "It's executed, sir. The system is flawless. They will wake up tomorrow morning to a silence heavier than any scream." Now the hum of the engine was the only sound. The Colorado mountains were looming, promising the solitude I hadn't tasted in 40 years. I watched the dense green give way to granite peaks, clean and immutable. I was accelerating into my new life, leaving behind not just a betrayal, but an entire lifetime of calculated obligations. When they finally realized the extent of their loss, when they understood that the old man they mocked had spent 18 months architecting their complete financial erasure, they wouldn't find me. They would only find the vacuum where their future used to be. And that silence, that absolute, echoing void, was my final, perfect answer. The most painful realization wasn't the infidelity itself. That was predictable human weakness. The real sting came from their absolute, unwavering conviction that I was too dull, too old, or too broken to notice the shifting sands beneath my feet. They looked at the man who had built this empire from a single dilapidated warehouse in industrial Dallas, and they saw only a fading photograph, a convenient obstacle soon to be removed by nature. I continued to sit at the head of the mahogany table, reviewing quarterly reports, listening to Eleanor detail her latest charity gala plans, a gala funded entirely by the assets she was certain would soon be hers, free and clear. My son, Jonathan, a man in his late 30s who had never secured a contract without my name attached to the bottom line, would openly discuss future strategies for the company with the CFO, strategies that always involved sidelining my decisions. They didn't even bother whispering anymore. They mistook my silence for weakness and my exhaustion, the genuine physical toll of 4 decades of relentless work, for surrender. They were merely waiting for the death certificate to make their betrayal official. But long before they started measuring my coffin, I had been measuring the distance between us. The first step, 18 months prior, was establishing a bunker of neutrality. I rented a small, nondescript office suite 30 miles outside of Houston, registered, under a holding company named Ethos, the Greek word for eagle. This wasn't where I slept, but it was where I truly lived. Inside those 4 soundproofed walls, monitored by biometric locks that not even the NSA could easily bypass, I became the conductor of their slow-motion financial ruin. I needed evidence that was unimpeachable, cold, and exhaustive. My legal team, 3 specialists, none of whom knew the others were involved, and all of whom were paid exorbitant sums, through untraceable trusts, confirmed that emotional grievance was irrelevant. Financial malfeasance and premeditated exploitation were not. I started with the electronics. I'd always insisted on cutting-edge security for the estate, a habit born of protecting trade secrets, not personal feelings. Now those same systems became my eyes and ears. I didn't need to install new bugs. I merely activated the pre-existing, deeply buried administrative backdoors that only the original architect me knew about. Every call on the secure line, every text message exchanged between Eleanor and her lover, every spiteful email Jonathan sent about the old man's declining cognitive functions was duplicated, time-stamped, and archived on servers deep in an Icelandic data center. The keylogger on Eleanor's private laptop showed me the detailed spreadsheets she was sharing with Jonathan, outlining potential buyers for the subsidiary I had promised him. The irony was exquisite. They were selling off my company before I was even dead, using my own intellectual property to organize the theft. I even hired the outside help they would never suspect. A private investigator named Marcus, operating out of Phoenix, specialized in digital forensics and quiet surveillance. Marcus followed them for 6 months, confirming the rendezvous locations, logging the exorbitant purchases made with corporate credit cards, a new speedboat for Jonathan, a diamond necklace for Eleanor's birthday that cost more than some small businesses, and most critically, establishing the paper trail connecting Eleanor's lover, a man named George, directly to a questionable land deal funded by unsecured company capital. The investigation was not fueled by rage, but by the same meticulous concentration I used when closing a hostile takeover. Rage fades, calculation endures. Every evening, sitting alone in the sterile quiet of the Atos office, I would scroll through the evidence. It was like reading a meticulously detailed autopsy report of my marriage, 4 decades of shared life reduced to bullet points of greed and contempt. I never flinched. The pain had already been internalized, processed, and converted into fuel for the final solution. The execution of the plan was a masterpiece of corporate law and strategic divestment. The trust that held the bulk of the family assets, the one Eleanor believed was immutable and set to benefit her upon my demise, was in fact structured with a series of performance clauses tied directly to my continued involvement and discretion. They had laughed when I signed it years ago, thinking it was just the paranoia of an aging titan. They didn't read the fine print. No spouse or descendant guilty of material detriment to the principal's financial well-being, defined as fraudulent or disloyal behavior, could inherit a single dime. And now, thanks to Marcus and the Icelandic servers, I had the definition of material detriment nailed down with thousands of indisputable exhibits. The financial maneuver was more complex. Over a period of 12 months, I systematically moved liquid assets out of the traditional family portfolio and into 6 shell corporations, unrelated entities specializing in international commodities and venture capital, controlled solely by the Ethos Holding Company. I was dismantling the structure of my wealth brick by brick, right under the noses of the auditors and my own family. They saw stable accounts. I saw empty shells waiting to be evacuated. The final element was the sale of the main manufacturing division, the heart of the company I had spent my life building. They believed I was too sentimentally attached to ever sell it. That sentiment died the moment I saw the video footage of Eleanor laughing with George about how easy it was to manipulate the old fool. The buyer was a Japanese consortium, a deal negotiated in absolute secrecy, requiring my physical presence overseas for the final signing. That trip, that acceleration into the granite peaks, wasn't a sudden escape. It was the scheduled closure of the last major transfer. The paperwork was signed, the wire transfers were confirmed, and the bulk of the family fortune, the fortune they were already spending in their mines, was now securely locked in. Offshore accounts entirely inaccessible to them. I had left behind 3 items: a notarized letter to my legal team initiating the irrevocable trust dissolution, a signed divorce filing citing the evidence of fraud and infidelity, and a single USB drive containing every piece of evidence, addressed to the state prosecutor's office detailing the corporate card abuses. I wasn't looking for revenge. Revenge is hot and sloppy. I was looking for justice, which is cold, precise, and absolute. They hadn't just lost their inheritance. They were about to face the scrutiny of the IRS and the district attorney, armed with files I had spent a year and a half perfecting. They had spent 40 years of my life. I had spent 18 months erasing theirs. And they wouldn't know a thing until the process server arrived at the mansion, demanding their signatures on papers that meant they were finally, truly, alone. They didn't hear the silence I had built around them. They mistook my withdrawal for exhaustion, my quiet compliance for senility. They truly believed the old lion had lost his teeth, that he was nothing more than a figurehead waiting for the gentle, lucrative oblivion of death. This was their critical error, a failure of imagination rooted in deep-seated generational entitlement. I watched them on the security feed, a hidden stream I accessed every morning from my small Spartan office in downtown Chicago, miles away from the sprawling estate in Lake Forest they still called ours. Helen, my wife of 42 years, would spend 2 hours with her personal trainer, a man whose salary I paid and whose services extended well beyond metabolic conditioning. Robert, our eldest, continued to hemorrhage funds on his failed technology ventures, demanding wire transfers from the corporate account with the casual arrogance of a king demanding tribute. Sarah, our youngest, was planning a destination, wedding in Capri using funds she thought were untouchable. Money earmarked for the foundation I had secretly dissolved and rerouted 6 months prior. They talked about me constantly, of course, usually over imported wine in the dining room I had built with my own hands back in the summer of 1985. I didn't need a detective to tell me what they said. The microphones embedded in the chandeliers and behind the antique paneling transmitted every dismissive syllable directly to my encrypted server. "Just sign the papers, Helen, he won't even read them." "He looks weak, Mum. The doctor said his heart rate is erratic. We just need to make sure the trust is impenetrable before the end." Every piece of evidence I collected wasn't just data for the eventual lawsuit. It was a hammer driving a nail into the coffin of my past life. I listened to Helen laughing with her lover, discussing the renovations they would do once the old man finally checks out. I watched Robert authorize fraudulent invoices, believing my accounting team was too loyal or too lazy to notice. What they didn't realize was that my entire executive staff had been quietly replaced over the last year and a half. The old guard, the truly loyal ones, were now working directly for me, housed in a separate legal entity I called Sentinel Holdings. The new, young team at the main corporation, they were forensic accountants and corporate intelligence specialists, tasked only with documenting the theft and negligence of the board, a board comprised entirely of my family. The beauty of the operation was its absolute legality, its cold, bureaucratic precision. Justice, I found, was not a matter of dramatic confrontation, but of meticulous paperwork. I didn't hire some cliché private eye with a trench coat. I engaged a former deputy director of the FBI's white-collar crime division, now running a high-end corporate risk firm in New York. He brought in 2 of the sharpest litigation attorneys in the country, men who specialize not in settling, but in obliteration. Their instruction was simple. Do not pursue emotion. Pursue financial crime. We spent months constructing the perfect legal firewall. Every asset they had touched, every account they had pilfered, was meticulously tracked, categorized, and separated from the main corporate structure, making their actions not just marital indiscretions or petty theft, but corporate malfeasance and tax evasion. I had personally signed documents transferring liability for certain questionable past transactions they had insisted on years ago, directly to the holding company they now controlled. They had been so eager to assume control of the alleged fortune that they signed away their freedom. I remember the day I finished the master file. It was a binder, heavy and black, sitting on my desk in that sterile Chicago office. It contained the complete financial ruin of everyone who had betrayed me, the photographic evidence of Helen's affairs, the audited proofs of Robert's embezzlement, Sarah's fraudulent loan applications, and the consolidated evidence of massive capital gains tax evasion they were now personally responsible for. I ran a final check with my lead attorney, Mr. Thorne. "Is there any way they can counter?" I asked, my voice flat, devoid of the tremor of the old man they thought. They knew. Thorne, a man whose reputation was built on burying millionaires, simply tapped the file. "Mr. Vance, we didn't file for divorce first. We filed the sealed complaint with the Southern District of Illinois, detailing corporate fraud, and simultaneously alerted the IRS and the District Attorney's Office. The divorce papers are just the cleanup. When the process server hands them those documents, it won't be a notice of separation. It will be a notification of federal investigation, immediate asset seizure, and a civil suit demanding the repayment of every penny stolen, plus punitive damages." He leaned back, adjusting his tie. They will be ruined financially before they even realize you left them. That was the key. They thought they were waiting for me to die. I was simply waiting for the perfect moment to prove that I was the only thing keeping them alive. They were still planning their lavish futures, arguing about which shade of Venetian plaster to use in the renovated master suite. I closed the master file. The revenge was ready. It was absolute. The 18 months of planning, the cold nights spent watching my life unravel on a screen, had yielded this perfect surgical strike. I felt no joy, only a profound freezing calm. The next stage was simply watching the dominoes fall, and I knew exactly where I wanted to be when the process servers arrived at the mansion, demanding their signatures on documents that signaled the end of their undeserved reign and the beginning of the long, cold reckoning. The 18 months of planning, the cold nights spent watching my life unravel on a screen, had yielded this perfect surgical strike. I felt no joy, only a profound freezing calm. The next stage was simply watching the dominoes fall. And I knew exactly where I wanted to be when the process servers arrived at the mansion, demanding their signatures on documents that signaled the end of their undeserved reign and the beginning of the long, cold reckoning. I was 3 states away, sitting in a rented condo in coastal Maine, far from the blistering heat and gilded cages of Dallas. The sea air was sharp and clean, a stark contrast to the perfumed, stale air of the life I had abandoned. They never understood me, not really. Catherine and James, my wife and my son, they saw me only as a fixture, the provider, the aging architect of a vast financial edifice who was, quite frankly, taking too long to die. Their latest offense, the one that truly sealed the timeline, was James's purchase of that vintage Maserati, a 6-figure indulgence bought directly from the corporate account, listed deceptively as fleet maintenance. He didn't bother to hide it well. He didn't need to. He knew I rarely checked the granular expenses anymore. That was the core of their fatal flaw. They confused my trust with senility, my exhaustion with weakness. They saw the grey hair and the slight tremor in my hands, the price paid for dedicating 4 decades to building the Midland Group, and mistook it for surrender. They believed the man who had hammered out the first oil leases in West Texas in the summer of 1985, who had survived 3 market crashes and 2 hostile takeovers, was now a doddering fool waiting for the Grim Reaper to sign his checks over to them. They didn't see the hidden cameras I had, installed months ago, not the cheap spy shop junk, but high-end encrypted systems installed by a retired NSA specialist named Sarah Vance. Sarah's work was exquisite. She didn't just capture Catherine's clandestine meetings with her personal trainer, who also happened to be a former convict with an alarming taste for expensive watches. She captured the conversations. Not the sighs and kisses, but the planning. The details of how they intended to force a premature buyout of my shares, leveraging James's board seat. They weren't just stealing my money, they were attempting to hijack my legacy. Mr. Harrison, my corporate counsel for 30 years, the only man I still trusted implicitly, sat across from me now, the stack of binders on the coffee table resembling funeral rites. Harrison had been my silent partner in this operation, the legal executioner. "The shell companies are dissolved, Arthur," Harrison confirmed, his voice low and steady, as if discussing the weather. "The liquid assets have been funneled into the Arthur Legacy Trust. It's impenetrable, based in Geneva, managed by independent third parties. Catherine and James are beneficiaries of a small, irrevocable annuity, enough to keep them fed and housed modestly, but zero access to capital, zero control." "And the Midland shares?" I asked, knowing the answer, but needing to hear the finality. "All transferred this morning, just before the market opened. They belong to the trust now. If they try to force a sale or seize my assets, they will find nothing but empty accounts and liabilities. Midland Group will continue, but their financial claim on it has been surgically excised. They are inheriting debt, not fortune." It was ruthless, yes, but the alternative was watching them dismantle what I had built on the backs of thousands of hard-working families. This wasn't personal spite anymore. It was corporate defense disguised as domestic revenge. Catherine had been married to me for 32 years. I had given her security, 2 beautiful homes, the freedom to pursue whatever frivolous passion struck her, from charity galas to equestrian competitions. When I started Midland, she stood by my side typing invoices until 2 a.m. I remembered those days clearly. But somewhere along the line, the shared dream had soured into pure entitlement. She stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as a barrier to the full realization of her opulent fantasies. The tapes confirmed it. She wasn't cheating for love or passion. She was cheating with men who reaffirmed her perceived importance while she waited for the main prize, my death. James was worse. Raised in luxury, he had never learned the value of a dollar. He viewed Midland not as a business, but as a family credit card. I had tried to mentor him, to bring him into the fold, but every attempt ended in a fight or an eye roll. The disrespect was a continuous, dull ache, now calcified into resolve. The process servers were scheduled to arrive at 10 a.m. Central Time. It was 9:45 a.m. on my clock here in Maine. I imagined the Dallas mansion, flooded with morning sunlight, Catherine sipping her expensive coffee, scrolling through diamond catalogues, and James probably nursing a hangover in the game room, checking the latest auction prices for vintage sports cars. They were secure in their universe, a universe I had built, and one which I was now collapsing. I picked up the secure satellite phone. "Sarah," I said, my voice steady, "are you monitoring their personal accounts?" "Affirmative, Mr. Thorne," Sarah's voice crackled back from her remote monitoring station. "The second the papers are served, the banks are executing the freeze orders and the seizure of the assets tied to the fraudulent corporate expenses. James's Maserati and Catherine's private yacht are the first to go. Repossession agents are standing by 2 blocks from the mansion." A small, grim smile touched my lips. The coldness I felt was not the absence of emotion, but the deep satisfaction of perfect mechanical alignment. The trap was sprung, the mechanism humming. I pulled the curtain back, looking out at the grey Atlantic, the waves crashing relentlessly against the shore. I thought back to a promise I had made to myself the night I first saw the irrefutable evidence. I won't raise my voice, I won't plead. I will simply erase them from the equation. I didn't want their grief or their repentance. I wanted their confusion, their sudden, terrifying realization that the floor beneath their feet had been concrete 1 minute, and the next it was a 100-foot drop. The clock ticked to 9:59 a.m. Dallas time. Soon the screaming would begin, 3 states away, and I would finally be free to listen to the silence. It wasn't just the betrayal that cut deep. It was the sheer breathtaking arrogance of it. They didn't just step over the lines I drew, they tap-danced on them, laughing, assuming the old man was too deaf, too blind, or too sentimental to ever realize. They had watched me run Sterling Holdings for 4 decades, building it from a regional manufacturing plant into a global entity. Yet they truly believed I would simply hand over the keys and then conveniently fade into the fog of dementia. They saw the white hair and mistook experience for exhaustion. They saw the quiet nights and mistook contemplation for senility. I remember one night, perhaps 3 weeks before I received the final evidence I needed. Eleanor and my daughter Clara were planning a trip to the south of France. I was sitting in my favorite leather chair, ostensibly reading a market report, but really, I was watching them. They were discussing the maintenance budget for the Santa Monica house, a budget that had mysteriously doubled in the last year, and Eleanor casually remarked, loud enough for me to hear, "Just let him sign the transfers, Clara. He barely reads the paperwork anymore. He's happier if he thinks we're just discussing flowers for the foyer." Clara giggled. "He's a good provider, Mom, but honestly, he's starting to get in the way. We need to finalize the estate restructuring while he's still compliant." Compliant. The word tasted like rust and bile in my throat. I had spent my life building a fortress for them, only to discover they viewed me as the senile, inconvenient guard blocking the treasure vault. They were so focused on the horizon, the moment of my anticipated death, that they never bothered to look down at the carefully laid tripwires around their own feet. That conversation confirmed it. This was not a matter of infidelity. This was a surgical cleansing. 4 decades of aggressive business practices taught me one thing: sentimentality is a liability. When the truth finally solidified, a grainy photo of Eleanor and her personal trainer Chad signing documents together in a private room at a Houston law firm, I didn't reach for the whiskey. I reached for the phone. I called the people who specialize in silence and precision. The first 6 weeks of my investigation were an exercise in controlled, relentless paranoia. I didn't yell. I didn't confront. I simply treated my life, my marriage, and my family as a hostile takeover target. I contacted Wallace & Associates, a boutique law firm in Phoenix, specializing in high-net-worth asset protection and, ironically, hostile divorces. I told Mr. Wallace, a man whose eyes held the weary wisdom of 1,000 shattered fortunes, exactly what I needed. I want the structure to look seamless, legal, and utterly devastating. They must receive nothing that I have earned, and they must not know it's coming until the moment their access codes fail. Simultaneously, I brought in Mark, a former federal agent I occasionally used for deep corporate due diligence. Mark didn't just confirm the affair, he went deeper, tracing the funds Eleanor and Chad were diverting. It wasn't just frivolous spending. They were establishing offshore accounts and attempting to dilute my shares in subsidiary companies, preparing for a fire sale the moment my will was read. They were betting everything on my death. Mark installed systems they'd never detect. Micro-cameras disguised as air purifiers in the study, monitoring software loaded onto the private network David used for his online gambling, and, most crucially, a comprehensive forensic audit of every dime spent by the family in the last 3 years. The evidence was staggering. My son David was hemorrhaging corporate funds on exotic cars and bad investments, while Clara was using the Sterling Foundation's budget, a charitable organization, to finance her own luxury apparel line. They saw me as a wallet, a legacy, a name they would inherit. They never saw me as an adversary. That was their fatal error. The key to the clean sweep, as Wallace called the legal maneuver, lay in the irrevocable trust structure I had established back in the summer of 1985, long before the children were born. The stipulations were clear. All beneficiaries must uphold the standards of integrity and fidelity expected of the Sterling name, or their access to the principal would be immediately revoked and redirected to the Sterling Veterans Foundation. Wallace spent months updating every piece of paperwork, ensuring that once the divorce was filed, simultaneously in Dallas, Santa Monica, and the Cayman Islands, Eleanor would find herself outside the trust perimeter, receiving the bare minimum mandated by Texas community property law, which, thanks to strategic pre-filing asset protection, was virtually nothing. The children were dealt with differently. Since they were actively misusing corporate funds, the legal grounds were stronger. Their directorships were dissolved. Their trust funds, which they had expected to access upon their next birthday, were instantly reallocated. The letter detailing their termination was drafted with clinical precision, citing specific SEC violations, all backed by Mark's meticulous digital evidence. I spent the last night before the execution sitting alone in the office, signing hundreds of pages of documents. It was the hardest, coldest work I had ever done. It wasn't rage that fueled me. It was the quiet, absolute clarity of justice. I wasn't interested in retribution. I was interested in consequence. I looked at the mahogany desk, the calendar still open to today's date. My hands were steady. I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't threatened. I simply and efficiently dismantled the house they thought was theirs. My entire life, the foundation of my security, had been a lie, and the only way to build anything real again was to burn the scaffolding down. The digital clock on my monitor flipped. 10 a.m. In 3 separate cities, 3 separate couriers were now walking up 3 separate driveways. The legal notices were delivered, the digital access codes were instantly revoked by my IT team, and the restraining orders against Eleanor and the children, freezing their corporate and personal accounts based on the evidence of fraud, were activated. The silence in my Dallas office was deafening, but I knew, 3 states away, that silence was about to be obliterated by the sound of pure, unadulterated panic. The floor was gone, and I was finally free to listen to the sound of it dropping out from beneath them. The phone remained face down on the polished mahogany desk, its black screen reflecting the distant, muted glow of the Dallas skyline. It had been 10 minutes since the last confirmation email arrived. Documents served, accounts immobilized. I knew what was happening 3 states away in the gilded cage they called home, screaming, desperate dialing, the frantic realization that the safety net had been shredded. But the phone didn't ring. It couldn't. My IT team, the same team Eleanor routinely dismissed as the glorified help desk, had executed a systematic firewall, blocking all personal and corporate lines. Associated with the family names, they were entirely isolated, exactly as I had planned. They had always underestimated me. That was the central, fatal flaw in their beautiful, greedy calculus. They saw the grey hair, the occasional sigh of fatigue after a 40-year fight to build consolidated industries, and mistook experience for exhaustion. They interpreted my long silence during their increasingly ridiculous requests, the purchase of the 3rd unnecessary jet, the 7-figure investment in Michael's crypto Ponzi scheme, as evidence of my approaching senility. Eleanor, my wife of 35 years, believed I was merely a signature, a warm body required to maintain the corporate charter while she lived out some fantasy of a perpetual European vacationer. She saw my quiet study, the endless spreadsheets, and the complex legal structures I put in place back in the 80s as the boring infrastructure that funded her life. She never once considered that the man who built the empire from a single leaky warehouse in Queens in the summer of 1985 might be just as meticulous in its defense as he was in its creation. For months, they continued their charade, blind to the slow, precise tightening of the noose. The tipping point wasn't the millions stolen. I could weather that. It was the absolute, casual contempt. It was the audio file I received from my private investigator, Mr. Sterling, weeks ago. Eleanor was talking to her personal assistant. Sarah was within earshot, and the topic was the annual shareholder meeting. "He's practically a ghost," Eleanor had laughed, a cold, brittle sound that still echoed in my memory. "Just wait another year or 2. We'll be free of him and the trusts will open wide. Until then, just keep the cards charged." That settled it. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about surgical extraction of deep-seated disrespect. The investigation, which I dubbed Operation Clean Slate, had cost me more than their entire annual fraudulent spending, but it was worth every cent. I didn't rely on hunches or emotional confrontations. I relied on forensics. Kenji, my cybersecurity specialist, had cloned their phones, mirrored their cloud accounts, and installed discrete military-grade surveillance across all 3 primary residences: the Dallas estate, the Hamptons beach house, and the ski condo in Aspen. The evidence flooded in. Thousands of emails detailing coordinated efforts to reroute corporate funds through offshore shell companies Michael had set up. Medical bills for plastic surgery billed as executive stress relief seminars. And perhaps the most damning, the video footage. The footage, taken discreetly from the master suite of the Hamptons property, showed Eleanor and the aforementioned yoga instructor, a man half her age, going through my private documents, laughing as they signed my forged a signature onto documents that would have transferred a substantial portion of my preferred shares into a trust administered solely by her. They weren't just cheating, they were planning my financial assassination. I watched the screen, not with rage, but with a terrifying, almost academic detachment. I studied their movements, their arrogance, their certainty of impunity. This was not a betrayal. This was an attempted coup, and the penalty for treason, even domestic treason, had to be absolute. The legal strategy was layered like an onion. The initial freezing order was designed solely to incite panic and prevent them from liquidating any remaining liquid assets. But the true power lay in the simultaneous civil suits filed in 4 different states, naming them not just as beneficiaries, but as co-conspirators in corporate fraud. While they are now frantically tearing apart the Dallas mansion looking for cash or hidden keys, Mr. Sterling is finalizing the second wave of filings. The Hamptons estate, which they believe is their permanent sanctuary, is actually a corporate property held in a specialized, irrevocable Delaware trust, contingent upon my continued administration of the company. That condition was violated the moment Eleanor's forged signature hit the documents. Tomorrow morning, a moving crew hired by Consolidated Industries will arrive at the Hamptons. They won't be packing Eleanor's extensive wardrobe. They will be inventorying every piece of furniture, every painting, every silver spoon purchased with company funds since 2010. Everything will be tagged, stored, and prepared for immediate auction. By Friday, the keys will be handed to a new lessee. They are learning in the most painful way possible that the man they ignored was the man holding the map, the compass, and the only key to the vault. They expected tears, shouting, or perhaps a pathetic plea for reconciliation. They expected emotion. They received silence, meticulous legal execution, and the cold, unyielding mechanics of a financial system designed to protect itself. I finally lifted the inverted phone. The screen was still blank. The chaos I had unleashed elsewhere felt miles away, muted by distance and the thick glass of my soundproof office. I took a slow, deep breath, tasting the air of absolute surgical victory. The floor had dropped out from beneath them. Now, all I had to do was enjoy the quiet thud of their landing. My work was nearly done. They never learned to read the silence. That was their fatal flaw. For 4 decades, I built this empire not through shouting or grandstanding, but through the precise application of pressure and the patient harvesting of facts. They mistook my deliberate calm, the quiet retreat into my study these last few years, for exhaustion, for senility, for the comforting prelude to their inheritance. They looked at the grey hair I earned in the trenches of global finance, and they saw only a man waiting to die. They were already spending the money. Even after I initiated the first subtle legal maneuvers, the revocation of signing authority on the secondary trusts, the quiet liquidation of the less visible assets, they didn't notice the tightening leash. Michael, my supposed successor, was too busy financing his disastrous crypto venture in Austin, Texas, using funds he believed were untouchable. He was planning the yacht party for his 35th birthday, sending me invitations adorned with thinly veiled impatience. "Hope you can make it, Dad, if you're up to the trip." Amelia, my wife of 37 years, was worse. She had always treated the corporate credit card like a bottomless well, but now the expenditures were brazen. Trips to the Hamptons with her coterie of vacuous friends, investments in boutique art galleries that existed purely for laundering ego, and the subtle, horrifying truth Frank had delivered, the discreet penthouse rental in downtown Manhattan, paid for quarterly, for her little arrangement with the fitness instructor half her age. I remember the exact moment Frank showed me the aerial surveillance of that building lobby. It wasn't the image itself that shattered me. The emotional death had occurred weeks earlier when I first found the handwritten note in her glove compartment, a hastily scribbled reminder about a flight to Geneva that wasn't on our shared calendar. No, what truly killed the last vestige of the husband in me was the clinical detachment with which I viewed the footage. It was data, evidence, a violation of contract, and now merely the final, required affidavit for the impending legal slaughter. I had always insisted on absolute transparency in the business, but when it came to my personal life, I had become utterly opaque. They thought they knew my routines, my weaknesses, my predictable old man habits. They had no idea that for the last 6 months, our sprawling estate in Connecticut had been the most surveilled property outside a government black site. Every phone call, every text message, every whispered conversation about when the old man finally kicks it was meticulously logged, transcribed, and cross-referenced by Frank's team. My legal counsel, old Mr. Harrison, a man who knows the intricacies of corporate law better than he knows his own grandchildren, worked exclusively in my underground vault, a place no one, not even Amelia, knew existed. We spent hours structuring the legal labyrinth. The key was the sequencing. If I had simply filed for divorce or tried to cut Michael off publicly, they would have reacted emotionally, generating scandal and tying up the primary assets for years in litigation. They would have played the victim, the poor, grieving wife, the misunderstood son, against the tyrannical patriarch. I couldn't allow that noise. My justice had to be silent, clean, and irreversible. Harrison and I used the very structure of the holding company, the one I designed in the summer of 1985, against them. The original bylaws included clauses for gross financial negligence and moral turpitude by any beneficiary attempting to leverage company assets for personal, non-approved gain. Michael's frivolous startup loans, Amelia's undisclosed real estate purchases in the Cayman Islands, all documented, all flagged as breaches of fiduciary duty, even though they technically weren't directors. The beauty of the structure was that I had maintained the ultimate power of interpretation. I was the final arbiter of integrity. We created 3 distinct legal entities over a period of 4 months: the Phoenix Trust, the Janus Group, and the Reclamation Fund. These entities, funded by the accelerated sale of my private stock portfolio, became the new impenetrable vessels for my actual wealth. The original company, the one they believed they were inheriting, was hollowed out, perfectly legal, but functionally worthless, without the proprietary patents and offshore licensing agreements, all of which were quietly transferred to the Phoenix Trust. They never checked the subtle movements. Why would they? They were too busy monitoring my blood pressure and planning the renovations for the master suite they intended to share after I was gone. The ultimate blow was scheduled for the end of the month, the annual shareholder meeting in Chicago. Michael assumed it would be a rubber stamp affair, his coronation as interim CEO. Amelia would be there, wearing the new emerald necklace she bought with the card I was about to cancel. I ran the scenario 50 times with Harrison. The presentation would be brief, a simple professional declaration of structural insolvency of the legacy entity due to unauthorized capital depletion and the subsequent transfer of all viable operating capital and intellectual property to a new fully protected entity, the Phoenix Trust, of which I was the sole trustee. There would be no yelling, no accusations of infidelity or betrayal, just the sterile, crushing weight of corporate law. I leaned back in my chair now, the silence of the office absorbing the lingering tension. The chaos I had set in motion was just the opening salvo. The financial floor had indeed dropped out, but the real spectacle, the moment they realized they weren't just poor, but legally, publicly, and irreversibly dismissed, was still waiting. I knew exactly what Michael's face would look like when he realized the company logo on his shiny new business cards was now attached to an empty shell. I knew the look of absolute comprehension that would dawn on Amelia's face when the private jet she chartered for her Miami trip failed to take off, not due to mechanical error, but due to a banking error code 739, account closed, no assets. I had not sought revenge. Revenge is hot, messy, and leaves stains. I had sought justice, which is cold, precise, and leaves the ledger balanced. My work was nearly done, but I still needed to witness the final consequence. I needed to see the expression in their eyes when they realized they hadn't underestimated an old man fading away. They had underestimated the very foundation he had spent a lifetime perfecting. The heavy oak door of Mr. Thompson's law office felt like the mouth of a tomb, sealing us all inside the Manhattan silence. Victoria, my wife of 37 years, sat across the massive mahogany table, adjusting the cuffs of a blouse I recognized as costing more than a working man's yearly salary. Mark and Sarah, my children, flanked her, radiating the restless impatience of heirs waiting for the final formality. They looked triumphant, bored, and utterly unaware of the tectonic shift that had occurred beneath their gilded lives. They had assumed this meeting, ostensibly to finalize the divorce settlement and discuss the restructuring of the holdings, was merely the handing over of the keys. They saw the tired, white-haired man before them, the man who had spent 4 decades building a logistics empire from a single rented warehouse in Queens, and they saw weakness. They were wrong. They saw a man fading. I saw a debt collector arriving for final settlement. Mr. Thompson, a man whose neutrality was as expensive as his suits, cleared his throat, shuffling the thick folders before him. His eyes, usually coolly professional, held a slight trace of genuine pity, not for me, but for the fools across the table. We are here, as James requested, to formally present the final separation documents and the status of the Jackson Holdings Trust. Thompson paused, looking directly at Victoria. Mrs. Jackson, I understand you and the children anticipate certain allocations based on the preliminary agreements drafted last year. Victoria smiled, a sharp, predatory flash. We anticipate what is fair, Mr. Thompson. Half of James's life's work, which by extension is half of my life's work. The house in Boston, the Aspen Chalet, the 2 investment properties in Miami, and sufficient liquid assets to maintain our standard of living. Mark, ever the loudest, leaned forward. We've been patient, Dad. Just sign the papers so we can move on. I said nothing. My voice would only contaminate the clean, surgical precision of the documents Thompson was about to read. I simply watched them, cataloguing the self-entitlement, the casual cruelty that had blossomed in the fertile ground of unearned wealth. This was the crop I was about to harvest. Thompson opened the largest file. Let's start with the assets. Jackson Holdings was structured in 1985, a year I vividly recall, and was built upon a complex, layered series of shell corporations and subsidiary trusts designed explicitly for maximum tax efficiency and, crucially, protection from external creditors and internal mismanagement. Victoria shifted impatiently. We know the structure, Thompson. Get to the numbers. I am, Thompson replied, his voice flattening to a razor's edge. The primary asset, Jackson Global Logistics, was sold on Tuesday of last week. The transaction was finalized late Friday. The funds were immediately disbursed and liquidated, as per the binding and irrevocable instructions James put in place 20 years ago, instructions that tied the liquidity of the primary trust, the one you are all beneficiaries of, to the successful maintenance of the secondary charitable foundations. Confusion flickered across Victoria's face. Charitable foundations? What are you talking about? Those were tiny. They were small, yes, Thompson confirmed, but according to Clause 4B, should those foundations, specifically the Jackson Employee Welfare Fund and the Boston Children's Literacy Program, be found to be intentionally deprived of funding, the entirety of the primary trust's assets would be automatically redirected to a tertiary offshore holding company, rendering the primary trust completely solvent but assetless. My son Mark barked a laugh. That's absurd. We never touched the charity funds. Oh, but you did, I finally spoke, my voice low and steady, cutting through the rising tension. You all did. Over the last 18 months I watched. The excessive spending, the deliberate attempts to circumvent the annual donation mandates, the small constant draws on the foundations hidden under administrative costs or miscellaneous errors. You thought they were small enough to go unnoticed by a distracted hold man, but they were logged, every single one. Thompson slid a stack of receipts and bank statements across the table. These documents confirm that between January 2023 and the present day, over $4.7 million was deliberately diverted from the foundations by accounts tied directly to Mrs. Jackson, Mr. Mark Jackson, and Ms. Sarah Jackson. This action triggered Clause 4B. The realization hit them like a physical blow. Victoria's perfect composure shattered first. Her face drained of color as she understood the implication. Wait, Sarah stammered, gripping the edge of the table. Where did the money go? The company sold for billions. It did, Thompson said gravely, and per the clause, all proceeds went to the tertiary holding company, the James Jackson Legacy Trust, a trust designed solely to manage and distribute the funds according to the terms set forth by James, which currently exclude all of you. Silence. A profound, ringing silence, broken only by the frantic rustle of their panic. The Boston house, Victoria whispered, her voice unrecognizable, thin with desperation. The deeds are in my name. They were, I corrected, leaning forward just slightly, but they were purchased entirely through Jackson Holdings LLC assets. When the LLC dissolved upon sale, the lien placed on those properties, a lien you failed to notice because you never read the small print in the 2018 restructuring, was automatically triggered. The bank seized the properties this morning. You have 24 hours to vacate. Mark jumped up, his face purple with rage. "You can't do this! I quit my job 6 months ago. We leveraged the Miami properties for the new restaurant deal. I need capital." "You quit your job because you thought my death was imminent and the inheritance was secure," I stated calmly, watching the raw terror bloom in his eyes. "Your restaurant deal defaulted the moment the properties were foreclosed. Furthermore, the liquid assets you are seeking in the divorce, the millions you spent on the yacht, the jewelry, the European tour last summer, were funds you accessed while the company was still technically solvent. Now, those funds are recognized as a debt owed to the new legacy trust. Congratulations, Mark. You are bankrupt. You owe me money." Sarah started crying, a high, panicked wail. Victoria simply stared at the pile of legal documents, her carefully constructed world reduced to paper dust. She had spent a lifetime treating me like a stepping stone, and now the stone had been removed, leaving her dangling over an abyss. I rose slowly, feeling the decades of fatigue lift from my shoulders. Justice wasn't just about taking things away, it was about revealing the truth of who they were when the safety net disappeared. "The divorce papers are simple, Victoria," I said, picking up my coat. "You keep the few personal effects you brought into the marriage, minus the cost of wear and tear, and you receive no alimony based on evidence of financial malfeasance against the protected trusts. You are free. Now you have the opportunity to prove you are more than just the money I made." I didn't wait for their screams or their impotent threats. I walked out of Thompson's office, leaving the utter devastation behind me. The noise of their collapse was not my concern. That was the consequence of their own greed. Stepping onto the bustling sidewalk of Manhattan, the air felt cleaner, lighter. I took a deep breath, smelling the grit and the possibility of the city that I hadn't truly noticed in years, blinded by the stale opulence of my previous life. I hadn't sought the money for myself. The Legacy Trust was fully operational, its funds dedicated entirely to the charities and the employees who actually deserved them. I had kept just enough to be comfortable, enough to buy that small rundown cabin upstate in the Adirondacks I'd always dreamed of fixing up, a place where the measure of success wasn't the size of the portfolio, but the warmth of the fire and the quiet of the woods. I pulled out the old flip phone I used only for essentials. "Thompson," I said when he answered, "please remind them to call their own security team if they need an escort out of the Boston residence. My people are done." I ended the call, tucked the phone away, and began walking toward Grand Central. I was 66 years old, but for the first time since the summer of 1985, I was starting fresh. I was free of the parasites and the gilded cage. The ledger was balanced. The foundation I had built survived, stronger and cleaner than ever before, and I was finally ready for peace.